So hello, I'm Catherine. So last night, Shirley posted an image about the 7 deathly sins. And it seems like there were a lot of comments responding specifically to, can hearing people teach ASL? And the conversation just went on and on and on, and really it kind of got out of hand. There was many comments that were very inappropriate and not respectful of deaf culture. So I just kind of want to expand on a couple of things so that you all can learn a little bit more. So thing number one, first and foremost, native signers should be the ones teaching ASL. Who are native signers? You have deaf people themselves, and then you also have this group called CODAs. Now, a CODA is an acronym that stands for Children of Deaf Adults. And there seems to be a little bit of confusion about that. People tend to label CODAs as hearing, but really they're not. They rarely use that identity for themselves. CODAs can hear, yes, in the same way that a deaf person who has a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, they can hear some things, but does that mean that they accept that as their identity, that they're a hearing person? No. CODAs are completely separate from hearing people. Their world experience is very unique. They're kind of stuck between these two worlds, the hearing world and the deaf world. They're not 100% hearing, they're not 100% deaf, they're kind of in the middle, and that makes their world experience very different. Yes, they can hear, but their first language is sign language. It's ASL. So really the best two options for who should teach ASL are deaf people and CODAs. And if there are no deaf people, then you can go ahead and put a CODA in there, that's fine. Still, it's better to have a deaf person, but a CODA is acceptable because they grew up in that culture, in that community. Their understanding is much better than a hearing person's perspective. And so if you really can't find a CODA, or excuse me, if you really can't find a deaf person, best option is a CODA. Hearing people can learn and study ASL all day long, but we're not going to understand the deaf perspective. Take, for example, me. I am hearing, I study ASL, I'm an interpreting major, I spend all my time trying to become as fluent as possible, but at the end of the day, my first language is English, and there's many aspects about the deaf experience and about ASL that I will never understand because I simply don't live that experience. And so it's really not appropriate for me to be teaching it if I can't connect with that experience. Now, I know that some of you commented that your teachers were interpreters, and I guess that's okay. If you really have no deaf people and you really have no CODAs, that's like the next best thing. But they're not native signers. And so it can really have a negative impact on your learning experience. You really need to have a deaf person teaching their native language. Now understand that saying, oh, deaf people can only teach their language, hearing people can't teach ASL, that's not discriminatory. Someone made that comment, and really I just need to clarify, that is not discriminating against hearing people. Hearing people have so many opportunities, endless opportunities. If I want to be an educator, if I want to teach math or English or science, I just in general, if I were to get a teaching degree, I have so many opportunities to become a teacher and teach in many different types of environments. I can apply to different schools and I'm going to get a lot of different offers, and eventually someone's going to hire me. But if a deaf person got an education degree, they tend to want to go to the deaf institutes, but if the deaf institute isn't hiring, the public schools aren't going to hire them. And it's not because they're not qualified, and it's not because they're not capable, it's because hearing people do not hire deaf people. Deaf people are perfectly capable of teaching English or math or science, but there's so many barriers that are set up by hearing people. And really, teaching ASL is one of those rare opportunities where deaf people are almost guaranteed a job. A hearing person will automatically hire a deaf person to teach ASL. And so and that's really an opportunity for them to share their culture and their experiences. Consider this. I am a white person, and I can study African American art and African American studies and African American culture all day long. I can study that. I can get a degree in that, in African American culture, in African American studies. Does that mean I should be teaching an African American culture class? Absolutely not, because I will never experience what it's like to be an African American person. I am a white person. I have white privilege. I will never experience racism. And so to take a job from a person of color and say, I understand your culture better than you do, that's just wrong. I need to check my privilege. And it's the same in the hearing and deaf world. Hearing people have privilege. We have many opportunities, and deaf people are constantly having to fight barriers, both contemporarily and historically. And so taking their jobs and trying to teach their language is really just one of the worst things that you can do as a hearing person. Job theft and discrimination against deaf people, it's just not respectful. So now I'm going to go ahead and expand on this second point of mine, which is interpreters are not helpers. Absolutely not. Interpreters don't help deaf people. If that is your perspective as an interpreter, that you're there to help deaf people, then you have internal autism. You are looking down at deaf people as less than hearing people. Let's again go with analogy. Imagine, if you will, that we have a native Russian speaker and a native Spanish speaker. The two of them have some sort of business. They need to communicate for whatever reason, but the Russian speaker doesn't know Spanish. The Spanish speaker doesn't know Russian, so how are these two individuals supposed to connect? How are they supposed to communicate? You would put in an interpreter. So who is the interpreter supposed to help? They're both spoken languages, so who are they there to help? The interpreter's not there to help. They don't help anyone. They are simply facilitating communication. Both languages are equal, Spanish and Russian. There is no, one language is better than the other, or we need to help this other language. They're both equal. Now apply that same concept to the hearing and deaf world. If you have a hearing person who speaks English and a deaf person who speaks sign language, the hearing person doesn't know sign. The deaf person can't access English. So how are they going to communicate? You put in an interpreter. It's not that the interpreter helps the deaf person. It's not that ASL is a lesser language than English. They are both viable, certifiable languages. ASL is just as equal to English as Spanish is to Russian. An interpreter, that model of being a helper and just guiding and taking over for deaf people, is just a poor and lousy model. So if a deaf person requests an interpreter for an event, then they are requesting access to English. But really, deaf people get along in the world just fine without interpreters. They have to socialize with hearing people every day in situations where they don't have interpreters, and they figure it out just fine. They don't need our help. And really, coming from that perspective as an interpreter, that you're there to help, is just a very poor perspective to have, and it's going to have a negative impact on your ability to interpret. So really, I encourage you to have a scheme shift and really think about how you're impacting the community you're trying to serve. And this third point, really, I kind of already talked about. Codas are not hearing. They don't accept hearing as their identity. So really just these 2 points I wanted to emphasize. The deaf world, deaf people have so many different experiences, and they have so much discrimination, both historically and contemporarily. They have their jobs stolen, their language oppressed. Hearing people don't experience that. There's never been an instance where hearing people have been told that their language is banned, that they are not allowed to use their spoken language. Or even married. Hearing people have never been told that you two hearing people can't get married because you might make more hearing people, and that's going to be a burden on society. Deaf people have already experienced that. Alexander Graham Bell tried to make deaf people getting married illegal because he was concerned that it would produce more deaf people. He also was hugely detrimental in the Milan Conference, which really set the tone of oralism, that just completely banned signing in deaf schools. And that was a conference that was run by all hearing people. There's only a few deaf people that were there advocating for sign language. But the hearing people decided that deaf people should be learning how to speak, and they should not be allowed to sign. That's the best way that they should access education. And it set this whole tone of abuse and atrocities that deaf people had to experience. They had their hands slapped, they had their hands tied to chairs. Hearing people have never experienced that. Deaf people had their jobs taken from them. Deaf educators were in the schools signing to the children, and then suddenly oralism hit and they couldn't speak to the kids, so they were all fired and hearing teachers were replaced. Hearing people have never had that experience. We've never had our jobs taken from us from a deaf person. And so these are experiences that deaf people have been having for years and still experience now. And hearing people really need to be allies and support the growth and development of ASL from a deaf-centric perspective. We should not be taking over. We should not be teaching the language. We need to step back and support the deaf efforts to teach their own language and teach their culture. We should not be teaching ASL as hearing people. It's just a bad practice overall. Oh, you know what? I do remember I have one more point I wanted to make. There was a comment about how sometimes it's easier to learn ASL if you have someone who's speaking at the same time. And that's just simply not true. Simcomming, which is when you speak at the same time, is not a good way to learn ASL because you're not actually understanding the signs. Your brain is still processing in English, and you're relying on your understanding of English for that communication access. If I wanted to learn how to speak Spanish, what's the best way for me to do that? I can't speak Spanish and English at the same time. That's impossible. So how am I going to learn Spanish? I'm going to go to Mexico, or I'm going to go to Spain, or some sort of Spanish-speaking country, and I'm going to immerse myself in that culture, and I'm going to use that language every day without access to English, and that is the best way for me to learn. And it's the same with ASL. You really need to turn your voice off, hands up, and that's it. If you are simcomming all the time and signing and speaking, you're not learning ASL, you're just continuing to rely on your dependency of English. You can't learn new signs, you can't learn grammatical structures, you can't learn word order of ASL if you're reliant on English. So I hope that this really helps all of you kind of clear up some misconceptions. And really, I just want to emphasize that is hearing people, we need to respect deaf culture, deaf community, and deaf language. And if a deaf person tells you that you said or done something wrong, don't argue with them. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind and like add that to your list of things to learn. And I really hope that it's the opportunity for you all to gain some cultural understanding. Don't take this as an opportunity to just be mad or frustrated. Take this as a learning opportunity. Thank you.